Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken gave a stark assessment of where things stand diplomatically in the effort to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The takeaway was not, I have to say, particularly encouraging. Now, this comes one day after reports that something approaching the outlines of a diplomatic deal was being sketched out. Since the invasion began, there have been almost immediately some level of talks between Ukrainian and Russian officials. And ultimately, it seems like there are about three likely ways that this conflict ends. One would be an outright military defeat for Russia, where they incur such tremendous losses that the army just kind of implodes on itself. And it is definitely the case the invasion has been a wildly costly enterprise for Russia in just 3 weeks. The New York Times reports that more than 7,000 Russian troops have been killed in less than 3 weeks of fighting. That's according to conservative U.S. estimates. Pentagon officials say a 10% casualty rate, including dead and wounded for a single unit, renders it unable to carry out combat-related tasks. With more than 150,000 Russian troops now involved in the war in Ukraine, Russian casualties, when including the estimated 14,000 to 21,000 injured, are near that level. The second possibility here, the second possible end to the war, would be the opposite: an outright military defeat for Ukraine, a victory for Russia, with a full-scale occupation of the country, the installation of some puppet government friendly to the Kremlin. And after all we just said, the Russian military is still much larger than Ukraine's. And as bloody and brutal as it has been, the Russian army still continues to make small amounts of progress. But honestly, even that would not really mean an end to anything. The high likelihood exists of some kind of long-run insurgency, which is hardly a resolution, and also the occupation, functionally, of a country on the borders of NATO in Europe would be viewed as illegitimate by the same coalition of countries among ours and others that have condemned and sanctioned Russia. It would essentially create an enduring Cold War, a new one, for as long as the situation was not definitively resolved. So the third way this conflict could end is with some actual diplomatic solution, with a ceasefire, a withdrawal of Russian troops, and some agreed-upon path forward. There's real question about whether that is actually achievable and whether Russia is at all interested in that outcome, at least now. And there's some history here as well that's worth referencing. During Russia's violent intervention in Syria on behalf of the Assad regime, there were endless rounds of different kinds of peace talks in which Russia played a role. In 2016, a Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman had to deny the country was dragging out the peace process to allow its ally, President Assad, to gain an advantage. But that appears to be exactly what they did, and exactly what it looks like they may be doing now, stalling with peace talks while they continue to brutalize civilians. This is what Secretary Blinken said about that possibility today.
We support Ukraine's efforts to try to de-escalate through diplomacy, to reach a ceasefire, and, of course, the withdrawal of Russian forces. We appreciate the efforts of other countries, including France, Germany, Israel, Turkey, and others. But again, from where I sit, diplomacy requires both sides engaging in good faith to de-escalate. And I don't see signs right now that Putin is prepared to stop. On the contrary, if you listen to, just for example, his most recent remarks yesterday, that suggests that he is moving in the opposite direction.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continued pleading his country's case before major Western governments. Today, he was speaking before the German parliament, and he has been very open about wanting to sit down face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin, which would be the necessary level of talks needed to end this war. But again, we've seen Putin's Syria playbook, where he acts out these talks while butchering the population. And we are watching this horrific decimation of the civilian population and the bombing of shelters and hospitals, indiscriminate mass destruction and death raining down on Ukrainian men, women, and children. Earlier this evening, the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN directly challenged his Russian counterpart about these crimes.
I would like to quote from Into the Abyss, a documentary about executioners of the death penalty. One guard began crying and shaking uncontrollably when, I quote, "the eyes of all the inmates he had executed began flashing before him," end of quote. Ambassador, do the eyes of Ukrainian children women and elderly killed by the Russians flash before you? If they do, we may consider how to sponsor a decision to help you deal with perpetration-induced traumatic stress.
It's easy to see why, amidst the grinding cruelty of this war, there is, right now, no real diplomacy to be had. One major factor that could influence the progress of negotiations one way or the other is where China stands in all this. Of course, history is replete with examples of major late intervention changing the tide of a war, from the French helping in the American Revolution to the U.S. entering into World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. There have been reports that China is amplifying Russian disinformation about the war, and that Russia has explicitly asked China for military and economic aid. Some have also noted that China hasn't issued an official condemnation of the use of force by Russia like they have done in other similar circumstances. The Chinese ambassador to the U.S. denied all this in a Washington Post op-ed, saying, quote, in a phone call with Putin on the second day of the conflict, Chinese President Xi Jinping expressed China's desire to see Russia and Ukraine hold peace talks as early as possible and received a positive response. Tomorrow, President Joe Biden will speak to President Xi, and Secretary Blinken previewed today how the U.S. is approaching this conversation while confirming that China is thinking about doing more to help the Russian invasion.
We believe China in particular has a responsibility to use its influence with President Putin and to defend the international rules and principles that it professes to support. Instead, it appears that China is moving in the opposite direction by refusing to condemn this aggression while seeking to portray itself as a neutral arbiter. And we're concerned that they're considering directly assisting Russia with military equipment to use in Ukraine. President Biden will be speaking to President Xi tomorrow and will make clear that China will bear responsibility for any actions it takes to support Russia's aggression, and we will not hesitate to impose costs.